I want to start by explaining a little bit why I want to do this. The goal here is not to really be educational in any way. My intent here isn't to try to teach you about Stoicism, but rather to break apart a specific passage and the principles that are contained within and how they apply to my life specifically. I am definitely not an authority on anything about Stoic philosophy. I am not a philosopher, as I stated before. I've been living this way for about 4 years, which to me still seems like a very short amount of time, especially with the amount of information that's out there concerning Stoicism. I have read a lot, and I would say that I have a good grasp on how to live my life as a Prokopton. I personally don't have nearly the grasp that the philosophers themselves, translators, or historians have on the topic, and there's so much out there as far as resources that you can go out and read and decide for yourself if this is something that's going to be beneficial to you. But for me, this is simply a personal thing, more or less an audio journal. This process in and of itself is going to be therapeutic. Writing is probably one of my favorite things to do. I spend a significant portion of my evenings writing or reading, and this is kind of carried over into throughout my life is when I enjoy viewing something or reading something, I typically want to try it. I've done that with anything that I've enjoyed, whether it be a sport or a hobby. I try my hand at it pretty often, and in this case, and in how it's been ever since I started keeping my journal years ago, I like to write. I started with reading. I enjoyed reading, and then I started writing. I'm by no means a good writer. I am not educated beyond a few years of college. My grammar probably isn't the best. I feel like my structure is decent enough. I get my point across, and I feel like I can been pretty insightful for a average intellect type person. I nothing has ever come easy when I have written that I think is okay. It required a significant amount of effort and time. I'm definitely wouldn't consider it any type of talented person. I am going to do my best in the format to more or less freehand it. I have some notes here. I have a fully written version of what I want to say. It's like 8,000 words that I will provide in the description. For anyone who can't stomach the sound of my voice, as I can't, you're more than welcome to view the written version. I personally enjoyed writing it. I felt like I had to kind of restrain myself a little bit to not write too much because this topic is very dense. It's from one of Marcus's Meditations, which we all know, anyone who's ever read through his meditations, there's so much that can be taken from what he has to say, or I guess right in this case. A lot of what made me want to do this and to write about specific passages and dissect them and take the time to sit down and analyze and then turn around and share with you is it was something I read, and I think it was one of Seneca's letters to Lucilius. After running over a lot of different thoughts, pick out one to be digested thoroughly that day. This is what I do myself. Out of the many bits I've been reading, I lay hold to one. And what Seneca is saying here is to take a moment and step back and think about what it is that you're reading. I know for me personally, it's very easy to just read it as quick as I can, get it done, check it off on my list of things that I said I would do this month, and be able to bring it up in a dinner party 2 years later and sound like I'm well learned and read often. And I've done that with a lot of books. I have a pretty extensive library. It's full of all the staples, everything from Robert Moore to Nietzsche, obviously Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, Long. I've got a little bit of everything. Well-known authors, well-known philosophers, well-known psychologists. It's and it can be an ego thing sometimes for me, and that's something that I think Stoicism has kind of allowed me to step away from, because what's different about Stoicism is that when I first was exposed to it and started reading it, it's not something that you can just read and put down and forget about. It kind of affects you in a way that almost demands integration into your life at great cost to your psychological well-being. Honestly, I once exposed to a lot of this information, it made me very aware of how flawed and how weak in a lot of ways psychologically that I was. And I almost felt compelled to read further and to take action. And that's a big thing with Stoics, as we all know. Now, just with the way I lived my life, I would definitely consider myself a man of action, you could say. It may not be the right action, and I would say throughout my life, more often than not, it wasn't. But someone told me something early on in my life, and it stuck with me, and it was that any action is better than no action. And I worked in an industry in my 20s where it could be pretty high stress, high intensity, and you risked your life more or less. And before that I was in construction, and I'm in construction now, and there is very much a sense of power in action and being able to think quickly. But I believe with Stoicism, it's something completely different, and I have to kind of forget those old ways of thinking, because in Stoicism, it is more conscious action, action based on the four values inherent in Stoicism: virtuous action that is in line with the universe and in nature. And those are things I was not so much used to, actually being aware of how I feel and how my actions are affecting others, and processing something rather than just reacting. I have always, in my 20s and as a kid, had a little bit of a temper. So the concept of giving myself a few seconds to process something before making a value judgment of it and then acting on it was a new concept that Stoicism has given to me. There's a lot that Stoicism has done for me. Other than that, my day, for the most part at this point in my life, revolves around it. I wake up, and the first thing I do is I read Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. It was something that was suggested to me early on, and that's carried on until now. So that kind of gets my brain thinking in line as a Prokopton. It engages those gears, and it gets me ready for the day, because if I don't start my day aware of that, something will happen at work, then something else will happen, then something else will happen, and the furthest thing from my mind is virtuous action. I'm just trying to keep myself from killing the person next to me, which is not a good place to be. So as I go out throughout my day, it's obviously not every day, but it is more days than not, I try to think of others and be cognizant of how people are feeling around me. And something I will do periodically is ask one of my coworkers, how are you feeling today? How are you doing? Especially if it looks like they're not doing too well. They probably hate me, but if they look tired, or if they look sad or exhausted, I'm gonna ask, like, how are you doing? And the look on their face is first surprise most of the time that anybody cares, because the fact that another human being would care for someone else who isn't involved with them emotionally or sexually is a very foreign concept to many of the people who walk this earth these days, especially in the United States. So to me, that brings a lot of joy to my life, and I won't share them now, but that's led to a lot of conversations that it's almost brought tears to my eyes. Like, some people will hold these things in, and they just are waiting for an opportunity to release it. And I've been that person a few times before, and I would have never in a million years considered doing something like that before I became a Stoic. Like, as a very traditionally masculine man in my 20s, and grew up in a pretty masculine environment, in a masculine career, the whole concept of sharing my feelings or listening to the feelings of my coworkers was foreign. It was completely alien to me. nothing made me more uncomfortable in my 20s than seeing another man cry. Like, I would do anything to get out of the room when that happened. And now that's not the case. I can fully understand and be aware that I'm a human with emotions, and that's one of the biggest misconceptions about Stoicism, is that we don't or stuff our emotions, or we don't feel emotions, and that's not it at all. I have allowed myself to be more emotional as in my life as a Prokopton than I ever did before. Stoicism has given me emotions. It's allowed me to feel these emotions and to process them. And I am extremely grateful for that. And it's such a shame that Stoicism has that reputation as being that way. Anyways, I'm starting to get a little off topic here. Continuing on, my evenings, I write a journal. As I stated before, I've done a journal for I would say maybe 3 or 4 years now, pretty consistently. Of course, in my first few years, I would maybe do it a couple times a week, but now I do it every night. It varies what I write, and it usually begins with what weakness have I overcome today. And that's where I kind of take a look at my day, like where was I in a spot where I knew what the right thing to do was. I did not want to do it impulsively, but I did it anyway. So whether that weakness is anger, whether that weakness is lust, whether that weakness is anxiety, whichever it may be, it varies from day to day. But I try to pat myself on the back a little bit, and not in the egocentric kind of way, but like, you're doing okay, buddy. Like, you got a little progress here. And so that's involved in my journal. Obviously, there are days where I'm just not feeling it. I'm exhausted from work, and I'll write a few sentences simply because I committed to do it, but it isn't very extensive. I do know that the benefit that I get from it is directly relative to the amount of effort I put in. So obviously, whenever I put in more effort, and I have written some pretty extensive meditations in my evenings when I'm feeling good, or actually in some cases feeling bad, but bad with energy, let's say. There's a difference between feeling bad and tired, but if you're anxious and got energy, man, some of the best writing I've ever done is in those moments. Like, just the emotions are flowing, and my fingers are just click, 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 click on the keyboard, and it's just, next thing you know, I'm at 6,000-7,000 words. It may not be relevant to anything or legible, just a stream of consciousness, but man, is it therapeutic. So that's pretty much my day as far as the active things I do that involve Stoicism. As I stated before, a day doesn't go by that I don't fail regularly. I am more flawed than most, and I just feel so lucky and so, for lack of a better term, blessed to have an opportunity to live this way now, especially with the way that I lived before. And as we'll read in Marcus's quote, the last part of it is why you're still capable. And with a lot of the ways that I lived, as far as just workaholic, very dug in with the whole masculinity thing, very not emotional, and it paid a significant price on my psychological well-being. To be given the opportunity to actually kind of wind the clock back and repair some of that I feel very, very lucky. But like I said, I do violate my guardian spirit pretty often, and that is a term, and I use that very intentionally because that is a term that I really struggled with coming into Stoicism. I was, for the most part, an agnostic most of my 20s. I was raised in a Baptist church, and I think we're all familiar with how that whole thing goes. It wasn't a very pleasant experience for me as a kid. I was convinced that I was going to go to hell, so obviously I decided to tell God to go to hell instead. A lot of good that did for me. But I struggled with that concept. I would say now, not so much. I am changing my perspective to a universal spirit and just seeing a lot of the coincidences that have started to happen around me as I've been aware of the possibility of a creative intelligence. It may be coincidence, it may be creations of my own mind. Honestly, I don't care. It's just what I believe. Not to say that anyone needs to do that, or that it's virtuous that I do that, or that it's unvirtuous. If you don't believe in anything like that, I don't care, honestly, what you believe. Believe what you want. This is just me explaining, my perspective. I tend to prefer Stoicism as it was traditionally written by the early Stoics, which does involve a creative intelligence, but who's to say what anyone should believe? Some of the more modern interpretations of Stoicism, I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of opinions about them, and I honestly have no interest one way or the other what someone else thinks. For me, it was just good to ego check myself and understand that I am not a creative intelligence, and my brain is not the epitome of existence and in the end all be all to consciousness. And that was that ego checked, and that aspect of believing in a creative intelligence is what helped me the most. It's just understanding that I'm not the best the universe has to offer. Thank God. And that's a terrifying thought when I really think about it. Maybe that's why I was so anxious, isn't thinking that, oh shit, am I the only thing that's out there that's running things? Because if so, we are screwed. I am definitely screwed. So that revelation was very beneficial to me. At any rate, I feel like I've rattled on enough about myself, but I just wanted you guys, since this is the first one of these that I'm doing, to kind of get an idea about who I am and how Stoicism is integrated into my life, just so it gives you a little bit of perspective of maybe where I'm coming from. So with that being said, the goal, as I stated before, is to read a quote or a passage from a reading and then start to kind of meditate on it and dissect it and almost speak out loud about my thoughts on what the intention is behind what's being said, and also its application to my life in general. So with that being said, let's go ahead and read the quote. No longer wander in hazard, for neither wilt thou read thy own memoirs, nor the acts of the ancient Romans and Hellenes, and the selections from books which thou wast reserving for thy old age. Hasten then to the end which thou hast before thee, and throwing away idle hopes, come to thine own aid, if thou carest it all for thyself while it is still in thy power. Now, what a mouthful. I mean, it's very typical of Mr. Aurelius. His writing is very deep, and this passage specifically means a lot to me. It's one of the first that I read. It's out of book 3. And it's one of the ones that I read regularly, and not so much daily, but typically when I need a little bit of a boost to keep moving forward, I will read this passage. I think one of my favorite parts about it is hasten to the end which thou hast before thee. To me, something about those words are just I could read them over and over again. So anyways, what we're gonna do, as I stated before, is we're gonna kind of break this down. And the first part I want to break down is no longer wander at hazard, for neither wilt thou read thy own memoirs, nor the acts of the ancients and Hellenes, the selections from books which thou was reserving for thy own age. This can mean so many different things, and I started to write, and it was just one of those things where I had to kind of stop and just say, Garrett, keep it simple, keep it on point, and like I said, if you want to read the text version of this talk, this dialogue, it'll be down there. It's much more on point, a lot less rambling on my part. But what it's basically trying to say, at least to me, is when it says no longer wander at hazard, it's like stop living in fear, and it's not the kind of fear that you experience whenever a grizzly bear is chasing you. That is an impression, and your reaction to save your own life is typically going to be to run, and you probably shouldn't take the time to digest the ascent of that action. You should run in the opposite direction. It may become a virtue issue if there's a child or something in between you and the grizzly bear. Then maybe you should digest your reaction a little bit better on whether you're going to run to the threat or away from the threat. but we won't get too in depth there. What this really means is more or less the fear of failure for me. That's a big one. The fear of imperfection, another big one for me. The fear of wasting time, which I know in my case has caused me to waste more time than if I would have just done it. Like a lot of times I in order to save time, I will waste time. It's a paradox. A lot of things in my life are paradoxes. I could go into that at depth, but to me, the most delusional of all of them is the fear of losing what I feel I deserve. Or what I own. First of all, if I got what I deserved, I probably wouldn't be alive. And second of all, I don't own anything. As we all know, nature lends us things. She does not give permanently. And if I am attached to something to the extent that I feel like it's permanent or that it's mine, I am setting myself up for disappointment, to say the least. And I'm going to live a life in anxiety and fear of loss of that thing. As Seneca says in letter 13 to Lucilius, we suffer far more in imagination than in reality. And for me personally, I spent a lot of my life either in the past or in the future. Very rarely was I in the present. The present didn't really matter a whole lot to me unless a grizzly bear was chasing me. I was more worried about what I could have done better yesterday or what terrible thing was going to happen to me tomorrow. And that is a very shitty way to live, to say the least, because in almost all cases, what I was afraid of never happened. And the things that I was afraid of happening typically happened when I least expected them, and I never saw it coming. So all that time and emotional energy I wasted, which emotional energy, the concept of that was new to me. As of 4 years ago, I thought it was just this infinite, but I do have a certain amount of it. When I run out, bad things happen. Anyways, so I would just waste all this energy worrying about these things that would never happened. I think I've hammered enough on this part of the passage, so let's go ahead and move on to the next. For neither wilt thou read thy own memoirs, nor the acts of the ancient Romans and Hellenes. So I'm going to read a few definitions here, I think, that is relevant. That one, for me personally, something I've started doing over the last few years is when I read, and I picked this up from someone else, definitely not an original idea. I don't think I've technically ever had an original thought or saying or words. Everything I say or think, for the most part, I've heard from somebody else, or it's something that I've read. But at any rate, the process of keeping a dictionary next to me while I read and actually looking up words that I thought I knew the meaning to, or if something doesn't make sense, I'll read the definition of the subject, the matter in the topic, and a lot of times that will change my perspective. So anyway, I'm going to read first the definition of memoir: a narrative composed from personal experience or autobiography. And I think this definition works for what we're going to do here. And the second one is ego. Now, per Webster's dictionary, the ego is the self, especially as contrasted with another self or the world. So basically what it's saying is it's us, but more specifically, it's us and how we think others see us, or the world as a whole sees us. Now, that word ego has a very negative connotation, especially in today's world, the way people have used it, and there's thousands of self-help books on ego. Personally, my first introduction to how damaging it can be is a book called Facing the Dragon by Robert Moore, and it specifically talks about personal grandiosity, which is also rooted in the archetypical character traits and ego in a lot of ways. And then one of the second books that really helped me, which is another fellow stoic, Ryan Holiday, he writes a book called Ego is the Enemy, which was very powerful to me and changed the way that I viewed good leaders. I know in the past, to me, a good leader was a very masculine, strong, confident type person. And after reading Ego is the Enemy, it really changed the way I I viewed leadership and what was true leadership and true strength, and a lot of it really falls into the category of being humble and having humility, true humility, not the fake kind where you pretend or self-deprecate, and you did a great job or wrote something great, but you tell everybody it's crap. Or you're at work and you're like, I only had 30 minutes to do this. That's the best I could do, so it's not that great, when you spent all night doing it, and you're just setting the stage and trying to set the bar really low for yourself. That way you can exceed it. So real humility is is operating in the background, not taking credit for things maybe that you could, not arguing or a point specifically for the sake of winning. Hashtag Facebook. I can't tell you in my years alive how much time and energy, emotional energy once again, that I have wasted debating politics, religion, any number of things. If I thought I was right on a topic and I felt like I could prove I was right, which is first of all impossible on Facebook, I would take the time and effort to do it. I've written books on Facebook before. Like, I've lost sleep over it, and it's just really pathetic thinking back on it. And also knowing when I'm beaten and knowing when I don't know, and being able to acknowledge that and being able to listen to somebody else's perspective and be able to take it in without forming a judgment on them, and even worse, without being a contrarian to what they're trying to say. To me, real humility and trying to be humble is something that has really made a huge impact on my life. Now, of course, having an ego and being confident, or false confidence or false pride, does have some benefits, especially in the workplace. I'm not going to lie, I've probably gained a significant amount by doing certain things in front of the right people intentionally. And I'm not so much proud of it. I'm not saying that it doesn't help in some ways, but in the long term, eventually it's going to bite you. And for me, humility is a very consistent lifestyle. It's a very consistent, dedicated action without the concern of what others are going to think of you, whether you want them to think positively or you just don't want them to think negatively, but knowing that what you're doing is right and the best that you can do, and not having to prove it to anybody else. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and read one other quote from book 4 of Marcus's Meditations, and it goes like this: "He who has a vehement desire of posthumous fame does not consider that everyone of those who remember him will himself die very soon." And to me, that it ties back. Even if I were in my ego able to convince everybody that I'm just this wonderful guy, this hard worker, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. And to rewind back to what the original quote, concerning my own memoirs and wanting the ancient Romans and the Hellenes to acknowledge them and to read them, the fact is that they won't, because most people really could care less. And two, even if they did, they're gonna die, and so will I. Eventually our lives will end, and with them is gonna end our legacy, or for lack of a better term. So to rewind all the way back to what Marcus was saying initially in the first part of the passage, to sum it up, what he's saying is, stop living in fear of failure, and fear of worrying what other people think of you, or fear of losing or having your ego damaged, because at the end of the day, nobody cares and we're all gonna die. That sounds like some edgy thing that I would scratch on the desk as a kid, and maybe I am that edgy teenager still, as I look over at my bookshelf where the Wheel of Power is snugged in between Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. But I think the biggest difference here is it's not a powerless, nihilistic approach. It's more of a freeing thing. It allows me to live in a certain way that is freeing me from that ego, because I understand what truly matters, and what is real, what is quote-unquote permanent-ish, and what is not. And the fact is that sacrificing my virtues and living in fear and anxiety of today and or tomorrow and yesterday is just not worth what I'm going to get in return. That's going to eventually be forgotten, and in a lot of cases never really mattered to anybody in the first place. And now moving on to the last part, which is in the selections from books which thou was reserving for thy own old age. And now this obviously means, why put off till tomorrow what you can do today? And I know it's tied in really closely with what we've said before, but I feel like it does deserve a little bit of attention itself, because here you can substitute the word books with just about anything. It could be, that vacation that your partner would like, but you can't seem to find the time to do it because you're working. It could be, any hobby or change in your life that is going to be good for you that you keep putting off over and over and over again. I hear this a lot concerning retirement. I work with a lot of guys, and we work 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, and all the time you hear, well, I'm working now so that I can benefit tomorrow, and it's very much this whole suffer now so you can enjoy later. Now, don't get me wrong, the whole concept of delaying gratification to me is beneficial, and I'm not saying that we should pursue what we do in the moment with a lustful desire to just enjoy and be happy. I'm not saying that at all, but what I'm saying is that the delusion that there will be a tomorrow shouldn't prevent us from doing what we know needs to be done today. And as is stated in a very commonly known quote, is that it's not what people did do that they have regrets for when they've reached the end of their life. It's typically what they didn't do. And just because I have what I believe to be a noble excuse as to why I'm not doing what I need to do does not mean at all that it's virtuous. Now, there could be a multitude of reasons as to why I'm putting this off. And I learned pretty early on that it is entirely possible to be a lazy person and a hard worker at the same time. And just because I'm focusing on my career and sacrificing for my career, whatever I may be sacrificing, doesn't by default make that action virtuous. I mean, when it comes to like a Wall Street trader, we say that he is virtuous because he commits 16 hours a day to his career. I mean, the real intent here is in most cases money. You have to really look at is the intent behind the action virtuous, and of course, in virtuous intent without virtuous action is meaningless. As we've all heard, the road or the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, I'll list one more personal experience, and then we'll move on to the next passage. So, for me, having children. Now, I'm 32 years old, and it's something that I've obviously put off, and in a multitude of occasions have said it was either for my career or when I have more money to be able to provide them the life that I want. But after I've actually sat down and taken an honest look at this, a lot of the reason why I made that decision was, for the most part, from a very selfish place. And it sounded a lot better at Thanksgiving dinners to say, oh, I don't have kids because I'm focused on my career, rather than saying I suffer from a bone-crushing anxiety that I'm not a good enough person to raise good children. And if I did have children, and even if they were raised well and they were good people, they could get hurt, or they could die or be born sick. And this just ties back into what I was saying before about this constant being in the future and quote unquote future tripping and worried about things that haven't even happened yet. And my perspective was always centered in my ego, and how is this going to affect me? How is this going to make me feel? But the fact of the matter is that the world could use more good people, and me as a parent, have an opportunity to release into the world, for lack of a better term, a force for good. I have a lot of benefits that I didn't have as a kid. I mean, my father was a great man and he provided me so many things. But as far as from a philosophical standpoint and concepts of some of the things that I've been through that I could teach my children. And as we all heard, it's not about giving your children what you didn't have, it's about teaching them what you didn't know. And I feel like I've lived a life in a way that I've been provided a wealth of information that I could pass on, and ideally it could, allow me to send someone out into the world who then can affect other people's lives in a positive way. I mean, when you really think about it from a networking standpoint, the amount of lives that are touched by a single person is exponential, because it just goes out. Like, let's say you wake up and you cut somebody off in traffic. All right, well, that puts them in a bad mood, so you've affected that one person, and then they go to work angry and they yell at a coworker, and then that puts them in a bad mood, and then their child calls them and then they yell at their kid, the person that was angry at the coworker that I pissed off, and then their kid is now upset and goes to school. And I mean, this happens over and over throughout every day of that person's life. So we as human beings have a certain amount of responsibility to the impact that we have on society as a whole, especially concerning, our children. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that having children in and of itself is virtuous, or that not having children is unvirtuous. The only thing I'm analyzing here is my personal intent as to why I made that decision. And I've got to get real honest with myself when it comes to that. Otherwise, it's just never going to happen. I'm going to continue to lie to myself, and then eventually I'm going to be on my deathbed, and I feel that would be a regret that I would have. And I haven't even begun to acknowledge the whole aspect of having children as one of the most selfless actions, and it really infringes on my own personal freedom and the things that I can do, and it's a sacrifice no matter which way you look at it. Of course, there are benefits that come from having children, but at the same time, as the selfish, self-centered person that I can be, I don't want to give up my time. I want to be able to go and do whatever I want, whenever I want, and spend my money however I want, which is not, that perspective and that way of living is just not very stoic at all. And coming to terms with that and looking at it from that perspective has kind of helped me a little bit when it comes to this whole concept of children. And I honestly respect and admire all those parents out there who especially in this era, are raising children in the environment that they are. It can't be easy. I have the utmost respect for people who do that. But at any rate, I think I've kind of dragged that on as long as I should. So let's go ahead and move into the next part of what Marcus is trying to say here. So the quote continues, "Hasten then to the end which thou hast before thee, and throwing away idle hopes, come to thy own aid, if thou carest it all for thyself, while it is still in thy power." Now, in his own way, he kind of just reiterates what we've been talking about. And I'm going to follow this up with a quote from Seneca, because I feel like the first part, hasten into the end which thou hast before thee, can almost be misinterpreted as like hurry up and die, or get to the end of something, which I don't think is at all the intent behind this. So Seneca says, and I quote, "For we are mistaken if we look forward to death." Now, this is a partial quote, and it is somewhat out of context, and I can't remember the exact letter it came from. I'll have to be a little bit more prepared next time for you guys, but a quick Google search should yield the results you're looking for if you want to dig a little bit further. And I think this can kind of be interpreted as Marcus is saying, hasten to the path, more or less, rather than the end. Now, not to say that his words are insufficient or incorrect, or that I'm writing a better version of what he wanted to say. That is a very funny thought. But let's keep in mind too that depending on the translation, this isn't the original language, so a lot of this can kind of be open into interpretation to some extent or the other. In context with what he said before and what we know about Marcus, I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibility that was the intent behind it. So once again, I'm going to refer to Webster's dictionary, and let's look up the word hasten. Now, to sum it up, what it means is to move or act quickly. And I feel like what this does, when I see that definition, it kind of triggers in my mind the whole illusion, or I guess rather delusion, that there is going to be a tomorrow, a retirement, a relationship, or whatever in the future, and that it's something that I'm guaranteed, and that there's still yet time for me to act, which is just not true. As we all know, we're not guaranteed a tomorrow, and over in Stoic writings, we are told, to memento mori, to reflect on death, and not the kind of way that I think some of us may be familiar with, where we're laying in bed at night hearing our heartbeat, and we're terrified of the oblivion and terrified of what's going to happen after, and just eaten up with anxiety about the concept that it's all going to come to an end. And I know for me personally, a lot of that is really founded in the way that I'm living my life. If I'm not living in a way that is virtuous and in line with nature, and in a way acting on the four virtues and living on the four virtues, I have a lot of anxiety about death, because I feel like there is still changes and there are things that I need to do before I go. And the last thing I want to do is die in this moment having only achieved what I've done thus far. And I don't say the word achieved as in, your standard, a goal as far as making money, or we'll just say having kids or buying a house. But I want to morally be living in a way that if I were to die tomorrow, I can be happy with and content with my actions and my way of life. So with that being said, memento mori is more or less reflecting on that, but in a more positive way, knowing that yes, it will all come to an end, and if that end were to be tomorrow, what are the changes that I would make in my life today? And a lot of people, including myself, are terrified to really look at life in that way, because I don't know about you, but on most days there's a lot of things that I would do different if I knew I was going to die tomorrow. But it does have its benefits, and of course we shouldn't truly, at least in my opinion, live as if we were going to die tomorrow, because I can promise you, if I did that every single day, I don't think I'd get very far in my life. And of course we all have our needs to make a paycheck, and we have to go to work, and I can guarantee you, if I knew I was going to die tomorrow, I wouldn't go to work. So, but it just does kind of give us some perspective on life, and maybe pushing some goals and some changes up a little bit, because tomorrow isn't guaranteed, and to be a little bit more aware of that fact that time is very much limited. And one of the greatest things I feel like humans are really good at is convincing themselves that they're eternal. I'm really struggling to not go off on a down in a rabbit hole of other philosophers of the whole concept and delusion of death. There's a couple really good books that I've read throughout my life, because Ernest Becker is a really good one when it comes to being an author who writes about the fear of death and how that impacts each and every person's life. Maybe I can talk about that in another dialogue, but we'll go ahead and pass on that for right now. At any rate, let's go ahead and just sum things up here. What I feel like is the intent behind this is to, hasten to your path. Hasten being move quickly, make decisions, take action. Stoics are people of action, and do so quickly, because tomorrow isn't guaranteed. There may not be another tomorrow. You have a limited amount of time. I know for me, really hammering that home has changed a lot of the way that I view the world, and especially whenever I'm making a sense as to if I'm going to be angry or fearful. And when I zoom out and realize, you know what, at the end of the day, I'm going to die. I really don't need to be, stressed to the point of my hands shaking over something at work that's completely irrelevant. And even if the worst were to come true of what I'm worried about, would probably still just be forgotten in a week. And even more so if I died, the last thing I would be concerned about in that last moment would be anything that's going on with work. So at any rate, let's go ahead and move on to the next part. Come to thy own aid, if thou carest it all for thyself, while it is still in thy power. Now that first part, come to thy own aid, It's really quite an interesting concept, especially for Stoics, the whole concept of coming to thy own aid and helping thyself. And being, in some ways, it kind of sounds a little bit selfish, for aren't we as Stoics supposed to go out into the world and perform selfless acts and to be divorced from self? And I think the key to this conundrum really lies in understanding what it is aid truly is. And I know for a lot of people, knowing what's good for us can be kind of a tough thing to understand or to really grasp. And I think a lot of people mistakenly associate what they enjoy or what makes them quote unquote happy as being what is actual aid to them. A lot of times it takes some real self-reflection to kind of get an understanding of what's going to be beneficial to my life and how it's associated to those around me, which ultimately, in order for me to be used to my fellows, I have to, be somewhat sane myself. I can't transmit something that I don't have. So when he says come to thy own aid, I really think it means a lot to do with how can you have to make yourself better to overcome everything that we have talked about previously. And moving on to the next part, which I really think is one of the most beautiful things about Stoicism, is because it truly builds on itself. Like, you can't just kind of skip to the end. To all those people out there like me, where it's like, I want the reward now and I don't want to do the work to get there. I want the end result. It's impossible in Stoicism. You can pretend for a few days, maybe. I'd be surprised with many could even do that. I know me in the beginning, I kind of took that approach and it was very humbling, and it seemed like almost on those days that I would try that, I would just act out the worst. I would be the most angry. And I don't know if it was just because I was more aware of it that I noticed it, or if it truly was the universe just proving to me like, hey buddy, you got no clue what you're doing, so you need to start in kindergarten and work your way up. So at any rate, the second part is, if thou carest it all for thyself. And I think this is kind of interesting, and it ties into the whole quote unquote self-love movement, which has been a significant thing that's kind of been talked about pretty often, especially, I think it started with most of our parents. I say our parents, the baby boomers. They were kind of the first generation to start that whole concept, whereas previously the World War II generation, the last thing they were thinking about was themselves. If you were to walk up and ask any man, in 1930 how he felt, or any woman, this goes either way. I use the word man because I am a man, and it's what I relate to, and it's the easiest for me to speak on, but I'm sure it goes both ways. But anyways, you could ask how are you feeling? And they would probably look at you and they'd have no clue, because they probably hadn't thought about it in a while. The nature of existence back then was so much more difficult that we didn't get the freedom to really actually look at the concept of self-love or be self-aware of their emotions. And even further back in the early 1900s, as we were discovering a lot of the frontiers, it was a weakness, and it would probably get you killed, honestly, to be overly concerned about how you feel, or to be worrying about yourself or showing any type of real self-love. Now, that's not to say that it's impossible in existences in which they're very difficult, but it is definitely much easier whenever you live in a stable society. And we have a luxury, especially my generation and the recent generations, to have the freedom to focus on the arts and on philosophy. Now, of course, it's not a prerequisite. As we know, Epictetus was a slave. He didn't have the whole lot of luxury, and he was able to be a very committed and devoted Stoic, and to focus a lot on his own growth and the growth of his pupils. So it's not a prerequisite, but I would say that it's very unlikely to find a self-love guru in a battle, war-torn Afghanistan. It's just, they just can't afford the time. Surviving in the moment is far more important. Anyway, so back to the original self-love thing. I personally have seen how this can be translated into a very per- perverted version of it that really results in just self-serving, manipulative, selfish action where I can excuse my selfish actions because it's self-love or I need this. And this is why I said it's so cool that Stoicism builds on itself, because before I can do this, like, I have to know what aid is and what is going to really help me. And I can't really just act on impulse of what's going to feel good, because in most cases, what feels good for me typically isn't the best, especially if it comes in the form of a compulsion or impulse. Those types of things I try to acknowledge and pause and give myself a few seconds to acknowledge that assent and realize what its intention is for me and what it is for my life and my mental state of mind. So it's been a little while since we've used an example, so let me think of one here. So I enjoy living and working in a clean and tidy workspace. Now, in order to do that, I have to take the time to keep it clean and tidy. And in order for me to do that, I have to do it irrelevant or regardless to how I feel or what's happened that day. It must be a commitment and a condition in which I live my life. And it can be so easy sometimes, especially after like a 12-hour day at work, to come home and say to myself, you know what? I'm not going to do the dishes after dinner. I deserve this. I deserve to sit in front of my computer and watch YouTube until I fall asleep. Now, you see how easy that whole like self-love, self-care thing can kind of be manipulated into something that can be quite destructive, because my impulse is to not do the dishes, but the long-term return on that is negative, because now I am sacrificing a commitment that's going to impact me psychologically in a lot of ways. The truth of the matter is that one good action, however virtuous it may be, does not excuse a bad one or a bad inaction. There isn't some sort of virtue scale inside of my soul where I can add weight to one side or the other and I'll just kind of keep it on balance and I'll be okay. Now I've reserved the right to treat it like that, and I mean I have before, and I'm sure you can gain some distance in that way, but eventually it will start to get to you and I'll start experiencing symptoms such as anxiety, depression, unwellness. I won't feel right. I'll start to feel sick. And the funny part about it all is I can, in those moments, look in the mirror and honestly say to myself, I don't know why I'm feeling like this. There must be something wrong with me, when the fact is that there's nothing wrong with me. To the contrary, my mind is working exactly as it should. A true illness would be to not feel anything in the face of apathy, and those alarms of knowing when things aren't right are actually something that I've intentionally started to cultivate in my life. As I said before, Stoics are doers. In this task of cleaning my place in my office space, I've deemed these tasks to be virtuous and being in agreement with nature, and by not doing them and now being outside of nature and outside of the cardinal virtue of temperance, I'm living in conflict with nature, which of course is going to have consequences. So with that being said, I'm going to quote Seneca here, and he states, I say, let no one rob me of a single day who isn't going to make a full return on the loss. And when it comes to other people, maybe I can't relate as much, or at least I'm not as concerned. But when it comes to myself, there is no one on this earth who has wasted more of my time than me. How am I going to make up for that tomorrow? How am I going to make up for that today? These are the things I have to be aware of. Now, of course, you may be thinking that I'm kind of making a big deal about this whole situation, especially the example that I used, having not kept a clean and tidy workspace or place. But I'll leave you with this one thought, and we can move on. So everything, at least the way I've started to view it, everything I do matters. And this whole concept of me kind of picking and choosing what actions and what decisions I make that do or don't matter. But the fact of the matter is, with every action, with every ascent, I'm either moving towards virtue or I'm moving away from virtue. And as I start to move away, the next decision, the next vice becomes that much easier to engage in after I've already made a decision to step away, or made a small unvirtuous action, or have violated a commitment that I've made to myself. Now, in addition to this, I mean, yes, it may be a small issue, but if you're anything like me, 4 or 5 years ago, there were anywhere from 15 to 30 of these issues that were being put off or not done, things that I knew should be done that I'm not doing, and it took a toll on me psychologically and emotionally. Once I started to live in a way where I looked at all my actions as mattering, it was a big change in the way I saw things, in the way I dealt with things. At any rate, I hope I've provided a clear enough example of what I believe Marcus is trying to say when he says, "Come to thy own aid." So we'll go ahead and move on to the next part of the passage, which is, to me, a pretty interesting one. And basically what he says is, while it is still in thy power. This statement is really interesting in the sense that it seems a little contradictory, I'll be honest. Stoics are very big on free will. You can hardly read anything written by any of the major three that doesn't in some way revolve around human reason or free will. But at the same time, they are very much determinists when it comes to the way they view the universe. You hear the word fate mentioned over and over and over, and you've got to ask yourself, well, how can I have free will if the universe has already decided what's going to happen? And yeah, and to me, it's a valid question. And it takes some time, at least it did for me, reading a lot of Stoic of writing, and you kind of start to grasp an understanding of how the two can kind of live together, and how free will to some extent is limited, and it only involves us in our own thoughts, in our own actions. In our ability to impact the major stream of the universe is very limited. For the most part, what the universe wants to happen is going to happen. If you may have ever heard the term swimming upstream, and I've done this before in my life so many times, where it's just like, for some reason, whatever I'm pursuing in that moment is just really, really costing me a lot of energy, or a lot of just bad things keep happening. It seems way harder than it should be. And like, to me, it feels almost like I'm swimming upstream. It's like I'm using my free will to do something and move in a certain way that isn't my fate. It isn't my path. And the universe kind of bucks that by making it really, really difficult. And I'm a really hard-headed person, so I've cost myself a lot before in pursuit of things that probably weren't what I should be after. And that's not to say that we should just give up on anything just because it gets difficult. For me personally, I knew in my heart, most of the time, I knew if my intention behind what I was doing was just, if what I was doing is what I should be doing and pursuing, and if I was doing it for the right reasons. Not only that, free will is necessary for the concept of virtue to even exist. If our lives were on rails and people were either good or evil, and they were born that way, and there's nothing that could change it, and that's just how things were, and no matter what you did, you couldn't make any decisions or impact on your own. If that were the case, then it would be impossible to make a virtuous action, because to me, what makes action virtuous is the fact that you can make an unvirtuous one if you want. If the possibility wasn't there for you to make a negative, unvirtuous, or an action in vice, then making a good action would mean nothing. Then to me, that's what's so, I think, admirable, is that heroic struggle between virtue and vice, and that every person throughout their life is capable and does do bad things. And it's not that there are good or evil people, but throughout someone's life, they may go through points where they are good or evil at specific times. And I think it's that constant, back and forth psychologically that really, to me, is very admirable and makes virtue all the more important and worth something. And without free will, that wouldn't matter. It'd have no bearing whatsoever. So with that explanation behind us, I feel like there's basically two interpretations that we can take here. The first is, to me, seems pretty obvious, and when he says, while it is still in thy power, it can mean basically that the window for the opportunity or action could close permanently, out of your control. Obviously, if you die, you no longer have the power to do anything. Get paralyzed from the waist down, you're never going to run a marathon. Obviously, things can happen that can completely, even if you want to do something, you can no longer do it. Now, the second example I feel like is interesting, and although I would consider it more concerning, it is still a more hopeful situation, because at least in this case, there are examples in which free will of that person, they were able to regain it. Now, I'm just going to use the example of a person who's addicted to drugs, because I feel like it would be the easiest to digest. And this is basically a person who has used the substance to the extent at which it is rewrote the pathways in their brain to where they no longer are able to see reality. I think one of the key points about someone who is addicted to drugs or an alcoholic is that they live their life completely in delusion, in most cases completely unaware that they even have a problem. And it's impossible to make a virtuous action if you don't see anything unvirtuous in your life that you need to change. And that is the nature of drug addiction and alcoholism. And in many cases, it's damaged the brain to the extent at which people have foregone food and water and died of starvation or dehydration because of their addiction. So I think it's safe to say that their free will to some extent has been inhibited, and I don't think this just applies to chemicals. And when I say I don't think, there is some research behind this. It is whether by chemical or whether by action, the brain does change neurologically. If I habitually do something and develop a coping mechanism, my likelihood of being able to let go of that coping mechanism is very low, because my brain has rewritten pathways physically in the brain to reinforce a specific action. So, you know how I like my examples, we'll go ahead and go with another one. And I think a good one to use here would be the pathological liar. So I think we've all met people like this before in our life, and I've been around a few of them in my past, and it is so interesting to me to watch their actions, because it's so crazy that they can't see that everyone knows that they're doing it. Like everyone in the room, I can look across the table and I can see everybody knows that this person is lying, and they continue to do it. And their complete lack of empathy to the extent at which they can't perceive someone else's uncomfortableness with knowing that they're lying is quite appalling and interesting at the same time. And it's not to say that they're not accountable for their actions, because I do believe at one point when this person was a child and they were getting ready to tell their first lie, they had a choice then, and that was 100% on them to choose to take that lie and continue to repeat it. Now, obviously, what happened as a consequence of that lie is what decided on whether it was going to reinforce the action or whether it was going to dissuade the action. And a lot of children will develop coping mechanisms, one being lying from like overprotective parents, for instance. They learned early on that to tell the truth about how they feel and about what they're really thinking actually would cause them harm. So that obviously extends into their personality, and the mind automatically is going to start to distort reality to protect the ego to the extent to where the person no longer understands the difference between the true and the false. they're the same thing. They can lie to you, and they do it so effectively because they themselves don't think or aren't willing to acknowledge that what they're saying is untruthful. So going back to what Marcus was saying, while it is still in thy power as it pertains to the loss of free will, he's basically warning us that although we have free will, we can take actions and we can ingest things to the extent at which our free will be affected. And if we continue to make these decisions, we are willingly, keyword willingly, putting ourselves in a position to lose that freedom. So to me, the essence of free will is still preserved, but it's just not impervious to the consequences of our actions. And what could have only been a slight discomfort prior to change now becomes monumental effort because of the continuous repeated reinforcement of an action. And now our life to some extent is at the mercy to outside circumstances, such as an intervention or some event that is cataclysmic enough to shake somebody out of that delusion. And if we die before that happens, time has truly run out, which is what is reinforcing what Marcus is saying here, that we can surrender our free will to the extent at which we may never get it back, or at least not in time to make any type of real change. And now, that was a lot of words to explain very few of what Marcus said. And just to reiterate, to come to thy own aid while it is still in thy power. On the surface doesn't seem like such an impactful statement, but when you really start to take it apart, the implications of it are honestly quite terrifying. And that kind of brings me back to the memento mori phrase, which is to reflect on death and to understand, that time is going to go on, and we have a limited amount of time. And we have a limited amount of time to do the things that we know that we should do. And if we don't act on that, eventually what's going to happen is that window is going to close. And all of this is buried in deep delusion and fear, as we were talking about before. It is so important that we, first of all, make commitments. And second, that we stick to those commitments, no matter how we feel, no matter how afraid we may be, no matter how deserving we think we are to bypass them and to lay down and to waste time on YouTube and to lie because it's easier that way, and it causes less quote unquote strife, or at least we perceive that it does, but all it really does is it puts it off to a later date, and in many cases it amplifies it when it finally does come around. And to just live in the here and now and to make decisions as such. To sum all of this up, I've basically written out here in layman's terms, because for me personally, that's the easiest to digest, what Marcus is saying throughout this entire passage, based on what we've been talking about here. So, in my opinion, this is what he is saying. Do not live your life in fear of failure for the sake of those that might aggrandize your successes or mock your failures. For when all is said and done, neither will be remembered. Put nothing off that you know to be right and virtuous. Move now to the path you know to be in accordance with nature, in spite of all of your reservations and fears, for the day may come when the opportunity will leave you forever. And to follow that up, I'll lead with this. I'm exhausted. You might be able to hear it in my voice, but it's been a very, very long week at work. I've tried throughout the week to record different parts and have consistently deleted it or restarted. And the fact of the matter is, I've made a commitment to do this. I made a commitment to have something done this week. And I'm not going to let my ego or my perfectionism get in the way of that, because to be honest, I could probably do this over and over and over again and it still not be where my ego feels that it should be. So I made a commitment and I just did it. And what happens as a response and the product that is returned is not really in my control to that extent. And the more I try to enforce that control, it just becomes a self-feeding loop where it's just the product gets worse in my mind. Therefore, I try harder. Therefore, I become more anxious, which then makes the product worse. And at the end of the day, there is a scholar or even a philosopher. I'm just here as another human being who's kind of sharing his perspective of these writings and how Stoicism has impacted my life and the struggles that I personally go through and how all of this relates to my life specifically. And I think that's really important when we talk about these types of things, is to not put ourselves up on a pedestal. And I know I run into that so often whenever I'm listening to other stoic podcasts. I hear these guys talk and they sound like sages or saints, and it's so unachievable to me. It is a nice goal to set, and in some cases I doubt that what they present is obviously how they are all the time, and a few of them have even said as much. But I feel for me this is more or less an audio journal, just kind of me verbalizing and making the extra effort to try this on a different medium outside of writing, because I find in my writing it starts to get refined the more that I write. And sometimes just having the off the cuff thought of whatever you're thinking or whatever that impulsive thought is just come out and be on paper and be brought into existence without having the time to read it or backspace it, delete it, refine it, change the verbiage to sound smarter. The way I speak is not at all the way that I write, obviously, because I do take the time to, I keep a thesaurus handy and I try to expand my dictionary. But when I'm speaking, it's very much on a human level. It is the words I use or the words that first come to my mind, and I don't have time to allow my ego to get in the way too much in what I'm saying. And it kind of, in a way, forces me to be a little bit more honest with you guys. And by uploading this to a medium, it forces me to somewhat be accountable for what I'm saying, because I can remember, what I said that I do or what I'm going to do. And it kind of drives me to go out into the world and to live up to that. What's the saying? Fake it till you make it. I hate that saying, but it is somewhat relevant that if I want to be a some way, I first have to start acting as if I am that way. And eventually, after the actions take place, the mind will follow. Many days, especially like today when I'm recording this, like I don't feel like doing this. My mind is tired. My head hurts. But I know, and I've learned throughout the years, that if I take the action, if I continually take the action and I put effort into it, even when I don't feel like it, that eventually my mind is going to get on board and I'll start to see things change. But if I don't take the action, it just never happens, because there will never come a point in a lot of these commitments where I just feel like doing it. A lot of these difficult decisions and changes in my life, there's never going to be an open day on my schedule. It's never going to get any easier to do it. So at some point, I just have to draw the line in the sand and be like, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to let my fear and I'm not going to let my ego get in the way of that. So with that, I feel like this is a good place to go ahead and end this first cast. I hope you've learned a little bit about me. If you're new to Stoicism, I hope you've learned maybe a little bit about Stoicism. Like I said, I haven't been doing this for a very long time, and please feel free to back check anything that I've said against the material that's out there. Like I said, I'm not a teacher or a scholar. And as a reminder, this is also an open forum, so feel free to comment with questions, or if I've said something that's contradictory to any literature that's out there, feel free to share that as well. This is also as much an opportunity for me to learn as it is an opportunity for me to grow emotionally in my path. So with that being said, I just want to wish you all well, and I hope every one of you go out into the world and live by an example and show everyone how powerful Stoicism can be and what the life of a Prokopton looks like, not just through your words, but with your actions.